Late 1943. Betio Island, Tarawa Atoll. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki stood before his garrison of elite Special Naval Landing Force troops and delivered a boast that would echo through history. 1,000,000 Americans could not take Tarawa in 100 years. His confidence was forgivable. Betio was a fortress unlike anything the Allies had yet encountered in the Pacific. Nearly 500 pillboxes studded the tiny island, each reinforced with coconut logs, steel plates, and compacted sand. 8-inch naval rifles sat in armoured turrets covering every approach. Minefields, barbed wire entanglements, concrete tetrahedrons, and a barrier wall of logs and coral surrounded the island like the walls of a medieval castle. And manning these defences were some of the finest fighting men in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Shibazaki had every reason to believe his fortress was impregnable. What the admiral did not know was that in 76 hours, his entire garrison of nearly 5,000 men would be annihilated. Only 17 Japanese would surrender. The rest would die in their bunkers, on their beaches, and in desperate banzai charges against Marines who refused to stop coming. The Battle of Tarawa would become the bloodiest amphibious assault in Marine Corps history to that point, a nightmare of low tides, burning vehicles, and machine gun fire that turned the lagoon red. But it would also become the battle that proved American amphibious doctrine could crack any fortress in the Pacific, no matter how strong, no matter how fanatical the defense. And the men who proved it would do so with a courage that defied everything Admiral Shibazaki believed about the limits of human endurance. The Gilbert Islands sit along the equator in the central Pacific, over 2,000 miles southwest of Pearl Harbor. Tarawa Atoll is a chain of tiny islands surrounding a shallow lagoon, and Betio is its principal island. It is a speck of coral barely 3 miles long and no broader than 800 yards at its widest point. No natural elevation rises higher than 10 feet above sea level. The Japanese had seized Tarawa from the British within 3 days of Pearl Harbor, and by late 1943, they had spent more than a year transforming Betio into the most heavily fortified atoll that would ever be invaded by Allied forces in the Pacific. Admiral Shibazaki had replaced the island's original engineer commander, Rear Admiral Tomonari Saichiro, who had designed the defensive masterwork. Saichiro's primary goal had been to make Betio so formidable that any American assault would stall at the water's edge. Every beach approach was covered by interlocking fields of fire. Dual-purpose 13mm heavy machine guns were positioned to deliver flanking fire along wire entanglements and beach obstacles. The firing ports on many seawall emplacements were sealed off in the front, forcing the guns to fire only along the beach rather than out to sea. This meant that Marines approaching head-on might not see the muzzle flashes, but any man moving laterally along the beach would walk directly into a wall of bullets. Nearly 500 pillboxes, blockhouses, and other fortified positions covered every square yard of the island. Colonel Merritt, Red Mike Edson, the legendary Guadalcanal veteran serving as Division Chief of Staff, studied the intelligence reports and delivered a grim assessment to war correspondents. Imperial Japanese Marines, the best Tojo's got. He then added the observation that would haunt the planning staff. Every place on the island can be covered by direct rifle and machine gun fire. Japanese defenders on Betio would have scoffed at the notion that their fortress could fall in days. Their doctrine called for destroying the landing force at the water's edge, while the Yogaki plan brought bombers, submarines, and the main battle fleet to finish off the American fleet. They had watched their engineers labour for months, pouring concrete, stringing wire, positioning guns with overlapping fields of fire. They had minefields in the water and tank traps on the beaches. They had ammunition stockpiled in bomb-proof shelters designed to withstand direct hits from battleship guns. And they had something the Americans did not fully appreciate. They had the reef. A barrier reef surrounded Betio, extending hundreds of yards from the beach in every direction. Landing craft needed at least 4 feet of water to cross it. Anything less, and the boats would grind to a halt, stranding the assault troops far from shore. Major Frank Holland, a New Zealand reserve officer who had sailed Tarawa's waters for 15 years, studied the tide tables and delivered a flat prediction that sent a chill through the planning staff. There won't be 3 feet of water on the reef. Colonel David Shoup, the operations officer who had designed the assault plan, took Holland's warning seriously. He made sure the troops knew in advance that there was a 50-50 chance of having to wade ashore. What he could not tell them was how far they would have to wade, or what it would feel like to walk 500 yards through chest-deep water while Japanese machine gunners used them for target practice. The American answer to the reef was an ungainly vehicle called the Landing Vehicle Tract, known as the Alligator. These were unarmored logistics tractors, never designed for combat, but they were true amphibians capable of crawling over reefs that would stop conventional landing craft dead. Colonel Shoup had watched them operate during the Guadalcanal campaign and immediately saw their potential. Major Henry Drews, commanding the 2nd Amphibian Tractor Battalion, could provide 75 of the older models, many in poor mechanical condition after months of hard use. Their thin hulls offered no protection against enemy weapons. Drews scrounged 3/8-inch boilerplate and had it welded around the cabs for minimal protection. The added weight decreased the vehicle's already marginal buoyancy and slowed them further, but they could cross the reef. That was all that mattered. The fight to obtain additional vehicles nearly derailed the entire operation. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner objected that the slow tank landing ships required to carry new vehicles would need a separate convoy and risk losing strategic surprise. Major General Holland Howling Mad Smith, commanding the 5th Amphibious Corps, reduced the argument to its essence. No landing vehicle tracts, no operation. Turner relented, but only partially. Half the new vehicles went to the Army forces landing at Makin against much lighter opposition. The 50 Marine vehicles would not arrive in time for training or rehearsal. The first time the infantry would see them would be in the pre-dawn darkness of the assault itself. The Marines were also stripped of nearly every tactical advantage their planners had requested. Admiral Nimitz declared that strategic surprise limited the preliminary bombardment to about 3 hours on the morning of the assault. The imperative to concentrate naval forces against a possible Japanese fleet sortie ruled out advance seizure of neighbouring Betio Island as an artillery base and eliminated any decoy landings. Then Holland Smith announced his own bombshell. The 6th Marines, an entire regiment, would be withheld as Corps Reserve. General Julian Smith's tactical options had been stripped away. The 2nd Marine Division was compelled to make a frontal assault into the teeth of Betio's defences, with an abbreviated bombardment and only a 2-to-1 superiority in troops, well below the doctrinal minimum. Shaken, Julian Smith insisted that Holland Smith absolve him of any responsibility for the consequences. This was done. Getting the division aboard ship required an artful ruse. General Smith scheduled a large-scale amphibious exercise in Hawke's Bay, New Zealand, and arranged for trucks to haul the men back to Wellington afterward in time for a dance. Complacently, the entire division embarked aboard 16 amphibious ships for what they believed was a routine exercise. The ships weighed anchor and headed north for the Gilberts. For once, Tokyo Rose had no clue of the impending campaign. When commanders briefed the troops on their actual destination, Tarawa came as a surprise. Many had wagered they were heading for Wake Island. On the day before the assault, General Smith sent a message to his men that sought to reassure them the Navy would stay and provide support throughout, unlike Guadalcanal. A great offensive to destroy the enemy in the Central Pacific has begun. Good luck, and God bless you all. November 20th, 1943. Shortly after midnight, the crowded transports of Task Force 53 arrived off Tarawa Atoll. Debarkation began at 0320. The captain of the transport Xylin played the Marines' hymn over the public address system, and the sailors cheered as the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, crawled over the side and down the cargo nets into the darkness. Then things started going wrong. Admiral Harry Hill discovered the transports were in the wrong anchorage and ordered them to shift positions immediately. Marines dangled halfway down cargo nets as the ships weighed anchor beneath them. Matching specific vehicles with their assigned assault teams in the darkness became haphazard. Choppy seas made cross-deck transfers between small craft dangerous. The elaborate timetable began falling apart before the first shot was fired. The Japanese initiated the battle. Alerted by the pre-dawn activities offshore, the garrison opened fire on the task force with their big 8-inch naval guns at 0507. American battleships returned fire almost immediately, and a huge fireball signaled the destruction of an ammunition bunker. Then came the first of many coordination failures. The Carrier Air Group had postponed its planned bombing strike by 30 minutes without informing Admiral Hill. The result was a 25-minute gap, during which the Japanese coastal guns sat undamaged, and the defenders had time to recover from the initial shelling and reposition forces from the southern and western beaches to reinforce the northern landing zones. It was the kind of gift that could not be taken back. The preliminary bombardment, the greatest concentration of naval gunfire in the war to date, was awesome in its fury. Staff Sergeant Norman Hatch, a Marine combat photographer, watched the island disappear under rolling explosions and thought to himself that this was not going to be a fight. They would simply go in and bury the dead. Time magazine correspondent Robert Sherrod watched the same spectacle and thought no mortal men could live through such destroying power. Both men would discover within the hour how catastrophically wrong that assessment was. The bombardment had failed to do what mattered most. Very little of the ship's fire had been directed against the landing beaches themselves, where Shibazaki had concentrated his killing zone. The well-protected defenders shook off the sand, climbed back into their positions, and manned their guns. When the naval gunfire ceased for the final 25 minutes of the assault run, the Americans gave their opponents time to prepare a reception that would become legendary in the annals of military horror. The first wave of landing vehicle tracts struck the reef and crawled over it, commencing their final run to the beach. This part of Colonel Shoup's plan worked to perfection, but the last 200 yards were the roughest, especially for vehicles approaching the western and central beaches. The machines were hammered by heavy and light machine guns and 40mm anti-boat guns. Marine gunners in the open-topped vehicles fired back, expending 10,000 rounds from the 50-caliber machine guns mounted forward on each vehicle. But the exposed gunners were easy targets, and dozens were cut down. Major Drews, the battalion commander who had worked so hard with Shoup to make the assault possible, took over a machine gun from a fallen crewman and was immediately killed by a bullet through the brain. Captain Fenlon Durand, one of Drew's company commanders, saw a Japanese officer standing defiantly on the seawall waving a pistol, daring the Americans to come ashore. On they came. The first vehicle to reach Betio's shore was number 4 to 9, nicknamed My Dolores, driven by Private First Class Edward Moore. Moore tried to drive his vehicle over the 5-foot seawall, but it stalled in a near-vertical position while nearby machine guns riddled the cab. He reached for his rifle only to find it shot in half. 19-year-old Private First Class Gilbert Ferguson was among the troops aboard. The sergeant stood up and yelled, "Everybody out!" At that very instant, machine gun bullets appeared to rip his head off. Ferguson, Moore, and others escaped from the vehicle and destroyed 2 machine gun positions only yards away. All became casualties shortly after. Very few of the vehicles could negotiate the seawall. Stalled on the beach, they became targets for pre-registered mortar and howitzer fire. Japanese troops on the far side of the barrier tossed grenades into the open troop compartments. The crew chief of one vehicle was Corporal John Spillane, who before the war had been a baseball prospect with the St. Louis Cardinals organization. Spillane caught 2 Japanese grenades barehanded in midair and threw them back over the wall. A third grenade exploded in his hand, grievously wounding him. The former ballplayer's reflexes had saved every man in his vehicle, and his courage would earn him the Navy Cross. Private First Class Newman Baird, a machine gunner aboard another vehicle in the following wave, described the approach. "We were 100 yards in now, and the enemy fire was awful damn intense and getting worse. They were knocking them out left and right. A tractor would get hit, stop, and burst into flames, with men jumping out like torches. Baird's own vehicle was then hit by a shell, killing the crew and many of the troops. I grabbed my carbine and an ammunition box and stepped over a couple of fellas lying there and put my hand on the side so as to roll over into the water. I didn't want to put my head up. The bullets were pouring at us like a sheet of rain. Within 10 minutes, the first 3 waves had landed more than 1,500 Marines on Betio's north shore. It was a great start. But then Major Holland's dire predictions about the tide proved accurate. No landing craft would cross the reef throughout the entire first day. After about 1,000 hours, most troops had no option but to wade ashore from the reef, covering distances of 500 to 1,000 yards under well-aimed fire. The slaughter among the wading Marines was terrible. 70% of the first wave of 2 companies from the 3rd Battalion, 8th Marines fell, attempting to reach the beach. Robert Sherrod accompanied Marines from the 4th wave attempting to wade ashore. No sooner had we hit the water than the Japanese machine guns really opened up on us. It was painfully slow, wading in such deep water, and we had 700 yards to walk slowly into that machine gun fire, looming into larger targets as we rose onto higher ground. I was scared, as I had never been scared before. Those who were not hit would always remember how the machine gun bullets hissed into the water, inches to the right, inches to the left. Japanese gunners on the island watched wave after wave of Americans fall in the water, yet more kept coming. The defenders had killed hundreds, perhaps thousands, and still the Marines pushed forward. Survivors described the distinctive clang of a shell impacting a landing craft a split second before the explosion. Staff Sergeant Hatch watched from the beach as it happened a dozen times, boats blown completely out of the water, bodies everywhere. Yet still they came. Staff Sergeant William Bordelon, a combat engineer attached to the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, provided the first and most dramatic example of individual courage on the first day. When a Japanese shell disabled his vehicle and killed most of the occupants, Bordelon rallied the survivors and led them ashore on Red Beach 2. Pausing only to prepare explosive charges, he personally knocked out 2 Japanese positions that had been firing on the assault waves. Attacking a 3rd emplacement, he was hit by machine gun fire but declined medical assistance. He then dashed back into the water to rescue a wounded Marine calling for help. As fire erupted from yet another enemy stronghold, Bordelon prepared one last demolition package and charged the position head-on. He was shot and killed. Staff Sergeant Bordelon became the first of 4 men of the 2nd Marine Division to be awarded the Medal of Honor at Tarawa. In another incident that defied belief, Sergeant Roy Johnson attacked a Japanese light tank single-handedly. He scrambled to the turret, dropped a grenade inside, then sat on the hatch until it detonated. Johnson survived that encounter but was killed in subsequent fighting, one of 217 Marine Corps sergeants killed or wounded in the 76-hour battle. On Red Beach 3, a captain shot through both arms and legs sent a message to Major Henry Jim Crow, apologizing for letting him down. Major Mike Ryan recalled a wounded sergeant he had never seen before limping up to ask where he was needed most. Private First Class Moore, wounded and disarmed from his experience trying to drive My Dolores over the seawall, spent the rest of the day carrying ammunition to machine gun crews until he had to be evacuated. Then came a moment that crystallized the Marine spirit on Betio. Other brave individuals retrieved a pair of 37mm anti-tank guns from a sunken landing craft and manhandled them several hundred yards ashore under nightmarish enemy fire. They hustled the guns across the beach to the seawall. 2 Japanese tanks were approaching the beachhead. The Marine guns were too low to fire over the wall. "Lift them over," came the cry from 100 throats. "Lift them over." Willing hands hoisted the 900-pound guns atop the wall. The gunners coolly loaded, aimed and fired, knocking out one tank at close range and chasing off the other. There were hoarse cheers from Marines who minutes earlier had seemed beaten. Colonel Shoup finally reached Betio at noon after a harrowing journey. His landing craft had been stopped by the reef, and he had transferred to a passing vehicle that made 3 attempts to land. Each time the enemy fire was too intense. On the 3rd try, the vehicle was hit and disabled by plunging fire. Shoup sustained a painful shell fragment wound in his leg, but led his small party through the water to the dubious shelter of the pier. Standing waist-deep, surrounded by thousands of dead fish and dozens of floating bodies, Shoup manned his radio, trying desperately to get organized units ashore. Before reaching the beach, Shoup had engaged in a memorable exchange of radio messages with Major John Schotel, commanding the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, who remained afloat beyond the reef. At 09:59, Schotel reported, receiving heavy fire all along beach, unable to land all. Issue in doubt. At 10:07, boats held up on reef of right flank Red 1. Troops receiving heavy fire in water. At 10:12, Shoup ordered, land beach Red 2 and work west. At 10:18, Schotel's final message arrived. We have nothing left to land. It was not entirely true. Marines from Schotel's shattered companies had been landing piecemeal on Green Beach at the western tip of the island, where Major Mike Ryan was assembling them into a fighting force. But no one on the flagship or at Shoup's position knew this. Shoup had hoped the new Sherman medium tanks would break the gridlock, but the debut of Marine medium tanks was inauspicious. The tankers were valorous, but the division had never trained with medium tanks. When 4 Shermans reached Red Beach 3, Major Crow simply waved them forward with orders to knock out all enemy positions encountered. The tank crews, buttoned up under fire, were virtually blind. Without accompanying infantry, they were lost piecemeal, some knocked out by Japanese 75mm guns, others damaged by American dive bombers in a tragic case of friendly fire. 6 more Shermans tried to land on Red Beach 1, each preceded by a dismounted guide walking ahead to warn of underwater shell craters. The guides were shot down every few minutes by Japanese marksmen. Each time, another volunteer stepped forward to continue the movement. Combat engineers had blown a hole in the seawall for the tanks to pass through, but the gap was now blocked with dead and wounded Marines. Rather than run over his fellow Marines, the tank commander reversed his column and detoured around the western tip of the island. 4 tanks foundered in unseen shell holes in the turbid water. One surviving Sherman engaged a Japanese light tank and demolished it, but not before the doomed Japanese crew fired one final round, a phenomenal shot right down the barrel of the Sherman. By nightfall, only 2 of the 14 Shermans were still operational. When Shoup finally established his command post 50 yards from the pier along the blind side of a large Japanese bunker that was still occupied, he posted guards to keep the enemy from launching sorties. The approaches to the site were as exposed as any other place on the flat island. At least 24 messengers were shot while carrying dispatches to and from Shoup's position. His message to the flagship at 10:45 reflected his frustration. Stiff resistance. Need half-tracks. Our tanks no good. By nightfall on the first day, 5,000 Marines had stormed the beaches. 1,500 were dead, wounded, or missing. The survivors held less than a quarter of a square mile. Shoup later described the location of his beachhead lines as a stock market graph. Offshore, General Julian Smith reported up the chain of command the 2 most chilling words in amphibious warfare. Issue remains in doubt. Admiral Spruance's staff began drafting plans for emergency evacuation. But the expected Japanese counterattack never came. The principal dividend of the bombardment turned out to be the destruction of Admiral Shibasaki's wire communications. The Japanese commander could not muster his forces for a coordinated counterattack. It was a fatal failure. Had the Japanese struck that night with everything they had, the Marines might have been driven into the sea. Instead, the scattered, exhausted, furious leathernecks dug in and waited, sharing a grim confidence. They had faced the worst. They were quietly ready. The second day was another bloodbath. The reef and beaches looked like a charnel house. Bodies drifted in the water, wrecked vehicles littered the shallows, and the stench of death drifted all the way out to the line of departure. Major Lawrence Hayes's 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, attempted to wade ashore on Red Beach 2 and walked into a crossfire so murderous that correspondent Sherrod wrote, "This is worse, far worse than it was yesterday." Within an hour he could count at least 200 bodies that did not move on the dry flats. Yet progress came. First, Lieutenant William Dean Hawkins, commanding the Scout Sniper Platoon, had led the assault on the pier before the first wave even landed. Wounded by a mortar shell on the first day, he refused treatment. At dawn on the second day, he led his men in attacking strongpoints, firing on the wading Marines. Hawkins crawled directly up to a major pillbox, fired his weapon point-blank through the gun ports, then threw grenades inside to finish the job. He was shot in the chest but continued the attack, personally destroying 3 more pillboxes before a Japanese shell nearly tore him apart. It was a mortal wound. Colonel Shoup said of him, "It's not often that you can credit a first lieutenant with winning a battle, but Hawkins came as near to it as any man could." Hawkins received the Medal of Honor posthumously. On the western end of the island, Major Mike Ryan had assembled a makeshift battalion of stragglers from various units, including 2 repaired Sherman tanks. During the night, 3 developments had enhanced his position. There was no Japanese spoiling attack against his thin lines. Maintenance crews had worked through the darkness to repair the medium tank Cecilia, and a naval gunfire spotter, Lieutenant Thomas Green of the Navy, had arrived with a fully functional radio. Ryan took his time organizing a coordinated tank infantry naval gunfire assault. 2 destroyers in the lagoon responded quickly and accurately to Lieutenant Green's calls for fire. At 11:20, Ryan launched his attack. Within the hour, his patchwork force had seized all of Green Beach and was ready to attack eastward toward the airfield. It was the breakthrough the Marines needed. For the first time, General Smith could land reinforcements on a covered beach with their unit integrity intact. Meanwhile, Major Jim Crow on Red Beach 3 continued to be a tower of strength. The former enlisted man, Marine gunner, distinguished rifleman, and star football player was everywhere, his trademark red mustache bristling, a combat shotgun cradled in his arm. He exuded the confidence and professionalism that kept his sector from collapsing. "I had the Ringgold, the Dashel, and the Anderson in support of me," Crow would later report. "Anything I asked for I got from them. They were great." On one occasion, Crow authorized direct fire from a destroyer in the lagoon at a large command bunker only 50 yards ahead of the Marines. They slammed them in there, and you could see arms and legs and everything just go up like that. There were no stragglers in Crow's sector. He constantly fed small groups of Marines into the lines, and any man who landed on his beach was immediately put to work regardless of his original unit assignment. Shoup, despite his wounds, despite days without sleep, despite communications so bad that runners were being shot down trying to deliver messages, sent a situation report that became a classic of Marine Corps history. Casualties, many. Percentage dead, unknown. Combat efficiency, we are winning. The third day brought the turning point. Major William Willie K. Jones 1st Battalion, 6th Marines, landed intact on Green Beach and attacked eastward with 2 borrowed Sherman tanks, combat engineers with flamethrowers and demolition charges, and machine gun platoons attached to each rifle company. They made rapid progress, killing approximately 250 Japanese defenders and linking up with the battered remnants of the 2nd Marines within 3 hours. Meanwhile, Major Crow's forces on Red Beach 3 finally cracked the three-bunker complex that had contained them since the first morning. A mortar round penetrated the coconut log emplacement and detonated the ammunition inside. The medium tank Colorado maneuvered close enough to the steel pillbox to destroy it with direct 75mm fire. The massive bomb-proof shelter remained. First Lieutenant Alexander Bonnyman led a squad of combat engineers up the steep sand-covered mound, while riflemen poured covering fire into the gun ports. Scores of Japanese poured out of a rear entrance to counterattack. Bonnyman stepped forward, emptied his flamethrower into the onrushing enemy, then charged them with a carbine. He was shot dead, his body rolling down the slope, but his sacrifice inspired the surviving engineers to seal the exits with explosives. Several hundred panicked Japanese broke out of the shelter and fled eastward. Marines cut them down by the dozens, and a single canister round from a Sherman tank dispatched at least 20 more. Bonnyman received the Medal of Honor posthumously, the third awarded on Betio. 2 of the 4 Medals of Honor at Tarawa went to combat engineers. Somewhere during the confused fighting that day, Admiral Shibazaki died in his blockhouse. His failure to provide backup communications had kept him from influencing the battle after the first day's bombardment destroyed his wire network. Japanese archives indicate he managed to transmit one final message to Tokyo. Our weapons have been destroyed, and from now on everyone is attempting a final charge. May Japan exist for 10,000 years. That night, the Japanese launched what remained of their offensive capability. Major Jones had sensed his exposed position would be the target and prepared accordingly, arranging artillery support starting 75 yards from his front lines and naval gunfire beyond that. The first attack came at 19:30. A force of 50 Japanese infiltrated past the outposts and was contained after 2 hours of close-in fighting. A second attack came at 2300, a third at 0300. Then, at 0400, roughly 300 Japanese launched a frenzied banzai charge. The Marines met them with everything they had. Pack howitzers on Red Beach 2 and Betio Island rained a murderous crossfire. 2 destroyers in the lagoon emptied their magazines. Private Jack Stambar of Baker Company killed 3 screaming Japanese with his bayonet before an officer impaled him with a samurai sword. Another Marine brained the officer with a rifle butt. First Lieutenant Norman Thomas, acting commander of Baker Company, reached Major Jones on the field phone. "We're killing them as fast as they come at us, but we can't hold out much longer. We need reinforcements." Jones's reply was brutal in its necessity. "We haven't got them. You've got to hold." They held. Jones's Marines lost 40 dead and 100 wounded in the wild fighting, but they held. At first light, they counted 200 dead Japanese within 50 yards of their lines, and another 125 beyond that range, mangled by artillery and naval gunfire. Major Jones had to blink back tears of pride and grief as he walked his lines that dawn. Several of his Marines grabbed his arm and muttered, "They told us we had to hold, and by God, we held." The costly counterattacks broke the back of the Japanese defense. Had they remained in their bunkers, the defenders would likely have extracted a higher toll. Instead, nearly 600 chose to die on the offensive. Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson, the legendary raider who had been serving as an observer, surveyed the carnage and admitted, "This was not only worse than Guadalcanal. It was the damnedest fight I've seen in 30 years of this business." On the 4th day, Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth MacLeod's 3rd Battalion, 6th Marines, passed through Jones's lines and swept eastward. Marine assault tactics were now well refined. Led by tanks and combat engineers with flamethrowers and high explosives, they made rapid progress. MacLeod reached the eastern tip of Betio by 1300 hours, inflicting more than 450 Japanese casualties at the loss of 34 Marines. His report summarized the general collapse. "At no time was there any determined defense. We used flamethrowers and could have used more. Medium tanks were excellent. The last organized resistance fell at the re-entrant strongpoints on the border between Red Beaches 1 and 2, where Japanese anti-boat gunners had disrupted the landings of 4 different battalions. Major Hayes finally received flamethrowers and pressed his attack from the east, while Major Schotel attacked from the west and south. Colonel Shoup sent infantry and half-tracks out onto the reef to pin the defenders down from the lagoon. In 48 hours of sustained combat, Hayes's battalion had fired 54,450 rounds of 30-caliber rifle ammunition at these positions. But it was the flamethrowers and demolitions that finished the job. By 1300, it was over. At high noon, while the fighting in the eastern sector was still underway, a Navy fighter plane landed on Betio's battered airstrip. Marines swarmed over the plane to shake the pilot's hand. A jeep bounced along the pier with every remaining Japanese sniper trying to shoot the driver. Robert Sherrod commented, "If a sign of certain victory were needed, this is it. The jeeps have arrived." When General Smith received the nearly simultaneous reports that both final objectives had been seized, he drafted a message to the fleet announcing the end of organized resistance on Betio. It was 13:05, about 76 hours after Private First Class Moore had rammed Mai Delary onto the seawall to begin the assault. The arithmetic of Tarawa was staggering. The Marines, supported by naval gunfire and carrier aviation, killed 97% of the estimated 4,836 Japanese troops on Betio. Only 146 prisoners were taken, all but 17 of them, Korean laborers. The Marines captured only 1 Japanese officer, a 30-year-old ensign from Nagasaki, who told his captors the garrison had expected the landings along the south and southwest sectors and believed the reef would protect them during periods of low tide. He had been wrong on both counts. The cost to the 2nd Marine Division was 997 Marines and 30 sailors dead, 88 Marines missing and presumed dead, their bodies swept out to sea by the changing tides. The first pilot ashore reported seeing scores of floating corpses miles away, over the horizon. 2,233 Marines and 59 sailors wounded. Total casualties, 3,407 in 76 hours. The Guadalcanal campaign had cost comparable casualties over 6 months. The 2nd Amphibian Tractor Battalion lost over half its men and all but 35 of the 125 vehicles employed at Betio. The ratio of killed to wounded was significantly high, reflecting the savage nature of the fighting. The overall proportion of casualties among Marines engaged in the assault was about 19%, but some battalions suffered far worse. The organic Navy medical personnel of the 2nd Marine Division paid their own steep price. 30 Navy doctors and corpsmen were killed, and another 59 wounded while administering aid to fallen Marines under fire. Lieutenant Herman Brookhart established an emergency room in a freshly captured Japanese bunker, some of whose former occupants came back to life with blazing rifles more than once. In 36 hours, under brutal conditions, Brookhart treated 126 casualties. Only 4 died. Chaplain Wyeth Willard walked along Red Beach 1 after it was finally cleared. Along the shore, he wrote, "I counted the bodies of 76 Marines staring up at me, half in, half out of the water." Robert Sherrod walked the island and declared, "What I saw on Betio was, I am certain, one of the greatest works of devastation wrought by man." Lieutenant George Lillibridge had no nourishment at all until the afternoon of the last day, when one of his men mixed up a canteen cup of hot water, chocolate, coffee and sugar, and gave it to him, saying he thought the lieutenant needed something. "It was the best meal I ever had." When the battered Marines finally re-embarked aboard the transports, the Navy personnel were, in Lillibridge's words, unbelievably generous and kind. They were treated to a full-scale turkey dinner, and the Navy officers helped serve the food. But many surviving troop leaders suffered from post-combat trauma. Lillibridge had lost over half the members of his platoon and was consumed with guilt. Major General Holland Smith flew to Betio on the day the Marines departed and spent an emotional afternoon viewing the carnage. Howling mad, Smith was shaken. The sight of our dead floating in the waters of the lagoon and lying along the blood-soaked beaches is one I will never forget. Over the pitted, blasted island hung a miasma of coral dust and death, nauseating and horrifying. He walked the ruins with tears in his eyes. They came upon one sight that moved everyone to tears. A dead Marine leaning forward against the seawall, one arm still supported upright by the weight of his body. On top of the seawall, just beyond his upraised hand, lay a blue and white flag, a beach marker to tell succeeding waves where to land. Holland Smith cleared his throat and said, "How can men like that ever be defeated?" Admiral Shibazaki had boasted that 1,000,000 Americans could not take Tarawa in 100 years. He had 500 pillboxes, 8-inch naval guns, minefields, barbed wire, a barrier reef, and nearly 5,000 of the finest troops in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He had every advantage that fortification and fanaticism could provide, and he was wrong. Not because his defences were weak, they were the strongest in the Pacific. Not because his men lacked courage. They fought to the last man. He was wrong because he could not conceive of what American Marines would endure to take his island. He could not imagine men wading 700 yards through chest-deep water into machine gun fire because their boats could not cross the reef. He could not imagine a corporal catching live grenades with his bare hands to save his comrades. He could not imagine a staff sergeant charging a pillbox alone after being shot, refusing medical aid, going back for another wounded man, then charging yet another position until the bullets finally stopped him. He could not imagine a colonel standing waist-deep in bloody water, wounded in 9 places, a spent bullet lodged in his neck, refusing to leave, refusing to quit, telling the fleet, "We are going to stick and fight it out." Admiral Nimitz visited Betio and examined the ruins of the Japanese defences. He did not waver in his assessment. The capture of Tarawa knocked down the front door to the Japanese defences in the Central Pacific. Within 10 weeks, the lessons learned in those 76 hours of hell launched the Marshall's Campaign, with fewer casualties and in less time. The amphibious doctrine tested in blood at Tarawa would carry American forces across the Pacific to the doorstep of Japan itself. Colonel Shoup, the architect and executor of the assault, was philosophical in the end. As he recorded in his combat notebook, with God and the United States Navy in direct support of the 2nd Marine Division, there was never any doubt that we would get Betio. For several hours, however, there was considerable haggling over the exact price we were to pay for it. The price was steep, but the Marines of the 2nd Division paid it in full, and in doing so they shattered the myth that island fortresses in the Pacific could not be taken. They proved that no reef was too wide, no seawall too high, no bunker too strong for men who simply refused to be defeated. Admiral Shibazaki learned in his final hours what every Japanese commander in the Pacific would eventually learn. American Marines do not stop coming. Not in 100 years. Not ever.